first off, welcome, guys. I appreciate you guys taking the time to speak with us about this subject of the urban deer study. If we could go around the room, the virtual room that is, and introduce ourselves and what your guys' role was on the urban deer study.
Sure, I'll start and then I'll throw a name out next. So Nathan Hostetter, I was one of the lead scientists on the project, a co-principal investigator. I'm the assistant unit leader of wildlife at the North Carolina Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit and an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Ecology at North Carolina State University. I'm going to throw it over to April next.
Hi, I'm April Boggs Pope. I'm the current deer biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission, one of the several WRC folks who worked with them on the project. I was a later addition. I came on in 2024 when the project was already in full swing. So John Shaw and Mariah Bogus also worked a lot on it, as well as folks like Heather Evans and several other people.
I can jump in. I'm Hannah Darashay. I recently completed my PhD at NC State, and I was part of the project as the Human Dimensions grad student. So this work on this project was what went into my dissertation.
My name's Jared Lamb. I was hired on actually as the lead technician early on in the project, and there were so many questions that we had that I was brought on as a master's student to help answer some of those later on. So I graduated back in December with my master's degree from this project.
And I'm Micaiah. I was brought on as the PhD student leading the capture and monitoring efforts of the project. I worked, brought Jared on in that first year, and he stuck around for all of those years, thank goodness. I'm currently a postdoc working with Nathan and another co-PI, Chris Moorman, wrapping up some deer project stuff, but I recently finished my PhD as well back in December.
Well, thank you guys for the introductions, and sounds like you guys do a lot of cool work. For those that don't know me, I'm Alex Kissinger. I'm the livestock and forages agent. I cover Orange and Durham County. So as you're aware of those two counties, there's a big rural and urban buffer there between 40 and 85. And if you could see my desk right now, you would understand why I would want to talk about deer and all things deer. So we wanted to look at, we always think about deer in a rural sense, and especially the producers I work with. It's almost a love-hate relationship with that species. But then we don't think about it in the urban settings and other things. So I thought, folks I deal with would love to hear this topic. But we'll go ahead and get started. What were some of the factors that led to this study being conducted, and what kind of data points were you guys looking for?
April, do you want to kick this one off from the WRC perspective?
So I'll let Nathan fill in any details that I miss because yeah, I came on a little bit later, but we've got such a growing municipal area in Durham and other counties within the state. So Durham ended up being a great spot to look at the impact of urbanization on populations of deer, including their movement and demographics and things like that, and including human dimensions aspects of things like how do people feel about the deer? How are they interacting with the deer? How do they feel about potential management options and such? So, uh, we wanted to answer some of these questions among many others, and it really like spiraled out from there. It turned into a huge project, including the deer side of things and estimating their populations and demographic factors, huntable lands, which we had a huntable lands estimate from 2017, and we were trying to update that. And yeah, there were so many great portions of this project.
Yeah, Alex, I'll chime in with that too. That there were several factors that led to this study being conducted. A big one is that North Carolina is growing quickly, and many areas that used to be rural are becoming suburban and urban. And as that happens, deer are increasing living in spaces with people. And so, as April was saying there, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission increasingly needs information to help inform deer management as these areas continue to urbanize, and information particularly on how many deer are out there, how are they moving, what's their survival and mortality causes. But also, as April was pointing out, and as Hannah said, a big part of her project was understanding how people's perspective of deer and deer management strategies may actually vary across this urbanization gradient. So this project was really developed in a partnership between the research scientists and the managers at the Wildlife Resources Commission. And so you have the group that's here on the call today, but I also like to note the other folks that were on the project, including Dr. Liz Krepka with North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences at NC State, Dr. Chris Moorman at NC State, Dr. Niels Peterson at NC State, Dr. John Kilgo with the Forest Service. So this large kind of team we put together to better understand how deer are using these urban and suburban and rural landscapes, how they may differ in their use across these areas, how mortality may differ across these areas, and how people's perspective of deer and deer management may vary across this area.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I can remember growing up, and my grandparents would always say, and it's more of a rural area, that if you saw a deer track, that was something. And now I see 4 or 5 on the side of 40 going to my apartment every evening. So yeah, and when I'm out and about, I hear it all the time. Oh, the deer, this, the deer. If there wasn't for deer fences, there wouldn't be a strawberry in the county. So I appreciate that. So we have the factors and what we were looking for. What were some of the methods that you guys used to get that data and to conduct the study?
Okay, do you want to start with the capture and collaring that you led?
Yeah, I didn't know who you were pointing to. I'm like, okay.
You're
Um,
there to me.
yeah. So like we kind of mentioned, Alex, there were three main portions or projects under this big umbrella of the Deer Project. And so in my particular portion was the capture and monitoring efforts. And so to collect the data for us, we needed to capture deer and put collars on them. And so doing this in urban, suburban, and rural areas, we generally employed two different capture methods. We darted deer, and we also used drop nets, which is basically just a large net that drops down and they get tangled up. We drugged them so that they were anesthetized during our workup. And then we monitored them that entire time to make sure that they were doing okay while we fit the collar, took a bunch of measurements and samples, and then we released them. And then they started to collect the data on their own, just based on how they moved throughout the landscape, the spaces that they spent time in, and that kind of thing. In addition to kind of the movement and location data, the collars are equipped with a mortality sensor. So basically, if the collar doesn't move for 4 hours, it's presumed dead. And so we would go out and conduct necropsies to evaluate what caused the death for that individual. So we could kind of estimate how survival might change and might, be influenced by these different anthropogenic factors across this gradient. So those were kind of that's the meat and potatoes of the capture and monitoring aspect of data collection.
Jumping on some of our methods, not nearly as exciting as Micaiah and her team, but we conducted three survey efforts for the human dimension side of things. So our goal was to reach as many people as we could in the county, or as representative as we could, to get a full picture of what people's perspective on white-tailed deer and white-tailed deer management were in the county. So one survey effort was for just general residents. So we did a random sample from every parcel in the county that we considered to be non-industrial and likely privately owned. And then we also did a phone survey effort to talk to business owners as well to fill in the other gaps. And then finally, we also had an online survey where we targeted hunters specifically to try to get their perspectives.
And sorry, Alex, just not to like take over here, but I realized I'm sitting at my desk and I have actual collars sitting next to me. So I figured if you're okay with that, I can show you kind of what they looked like. So this is what an adult collar looks like. Sorry, I have my blur on, but generally pretty large and in charge. And so we put these on adult deer. And then we also did have an addition portion of our study where we were putting collars on neonates, so like newborn fawns. And so this is an example of what a VHF collar looks like for those little babies. They have these pleats that would pop as they grew and kind of would weather down with the elements. And so these were kind of at the basis and at the core of all of the data collection for us.
Alex, and then the third component of this study was the abundance estimation for deer and how that abundance varied across this urbanization gradient. And that was led by Liz Krepka and a master's student, Ashley Lynn. And the gold standard for abundance estimation is mark recapture. So you go out there, you capture an individual, you put a unique identifier on it, then you recapture it later. But the size of this study, covering all of Durham County and parts of Orange County across this whole urbanization gradient, just made that nearly impossible to do. And so they came up with this really intelligent way to do this of using genetics to get a capture recapture study. And so they reached out to landowners all across the county to ask if they could come in and survey their yards or their property. And they would go in and they would collect deer fecal pellets. And then they would send them back to Liz's lab at the museum and run the genetics on them and get a unique marker for each of those different piles of deer poop. And this gave us then a unique individual and how we could track it across the landscape, which gave us the data we needed for our marker recapture study to estimate abundance and how abundance changed across the gradient without ever laying a hand on a deer for that component of the study.
Oh. And were you able to, and I don't know if that data has been compiled yet or not, but were you able to figure out, you know, deer densities in the area more? I know I've always been told that the Wildlife Commission stops counting at 55 and I'm probably wrong there. But, were you able to find out what the deer densities were in Durham County based off of that information?
Yes, and importantly, the piece that Liz and Ashley really focused on was how density changed across the landscape. And what they found was a significant decline in deer density as urbanization increased. So as you move from the rural end of the area down to areas down towards downtown Durham, they picked up a significant decline in deer densities across the area. Some of the densities in the more rural areas were quite high, particularly areas near Treyburn areas and out near Hill Forest. But then we saw a general decline beyond that as we got to more urban areas.
Gotcha. Thank you.
For the WRC side of things on deer density, we typically look at antlered buck harvest as well as a population reconstruction model to get an estimate of density in an area. So, this is it's not as direct of a method as getting, fecal counts and such. We're looking at, the size of an area. We're looking at the huntable lands in that area that, Hannah and Nils and one of our folks, Christina Watkins, she did some of the human dimension stuff as well. But we use an estimate from the human dimensions side of things. To get at the size of an area, and then we try to estimate the population using that reconstruction model, and then we look at the antlered buck harvest as a percentage of like total harvest, um, and like across the state. So we look at that county, how many bucks it's harvesting versus the rest of the state, and then we get at a deer per square mile. uh, and for Durham County, we were estimating about 60 deer square mile using our population reconstruction, which, as I said, it's not a super direct way of doing that. And it also involves some estimating huntable lands and things like that. So it's a little different than what they got in their study, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, I know it's hard. You always hear people from outside of the outdoor side of things, how can you know that there's this many deer in the state? Well, we don't go and count every one. I understand that. But that stuff's pretty interesting to me. And, I've seen I'm from Ashe County originally, so deer densities for me in one side of the county there is different. So when I moved here, it was a whole different world. Um, but yeah, and Mr. Peterson, since you've hopped on, I appreciate you joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what your part or your role in the study was?
Yeah, so I'm Nils Peterson, a professor at NC State, and I specialize in studying how people interact with wildlife. And so the social human aspects of this project were what I focused on, primarily working with Hannah.
Okay. Well, well, thank you. I appreciate y'all hopping on again. This has been, I've been looking forward to this all week. But so we talked about the methods, and I can imagine some of those things are pretty challenging. Were there any like challenges that just stuck out from this study? And then was there anything that also surprised you while you guys were conducting or looking at the data?
I can chime in here if that's okay.
Mhm.
One of the big challenges that we had to kind of was daunting at the beginning, especially is when you look at a lot of these large scale GPS collared studies on these large ungulates. They happen in very, rural areas, big national forests, giant ranches, not on like almost a 100% private lands. And so coming into it, it was a daunting task to be able to, get access to capture deer on landowners' properties only not only in the rural areas, but also in these suburban and more urban communities. And so we had to put a lot of effort up front of reaching out to the public and getting access and just changing how we did things from one side of the gradient to the other. Like Micaiah was mentioning, we use different methods depending on where we were. So, like in the more urban areas, we had to capture deer on that property and we couldn't let them go 200 yards that way to another property. That's why we use the drop nets versus on larger properties, we could use the dart guns. But so that was, from my perspective coming in, that was like a big challenge. However, it also turns into the one of the things that surprised me the most is we captured deer and we interacted with over 150 landowners across the county, and everybody was just super receptive of us, because it was an operation when we came on their property to catch deer. It was usually like a 2, 3 week process of we would put corn out, we'd bait the deer in, we'd pattern them, and then we'd come in and set up this big cumbersome net that would be on their property for a week. And then we'd come in and basically take over their night trapping deer and drop the net on the deer, and then we were gone. And so it wasn't a slight commitment from the landowner to allow us to do that, but we were really, met with good attitudes and good graces across the entire county, which was really refreshing and something that I didn't expect coming into it. So it's really cool to have all that landowner participation.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. And that sounds like a very big undertaking. And how would you even, and this is just coming from me outside of, I've darted cattle, but we also don't have to collar them after we've darted them. How do you guys, do they just not go very far? Do you watch them, watch the drugs take effect, and then you just, okay, so there's not a long, drawn out tracking process afterwards.
Yeah, so Makai might have one of the darts sitting on her desk right now. I'm not sure. But the darts actually had a transmitter that's screwed into the back. You can see there, which
Oh,
she
okay.
might be better to describe it. She's holding it. But that would emit a radio signal that we could use a three-way Yagi to like basically whichever direction you pointed the Yagi and whichever direction the beep was the loudest was the direction that deer was. There's a lot more nuance to that, but basically it boils down to that. And that would allow us to track the deer once we darted them. So they would almost always run out of sight once they were darted. Sometimes, it varied. Sometimes they could run up to 500 meters away, which is why we really wanted to be on those larger properties. And yet sometimes there was deer that, were darted and came back to the corn pile and we actually watched them, go under the drugs. So It varied. It averaged around 200 meters away, but we were able to track to them pretty much every time with those darts and with the transmitters.
I've never seen a dart with a transmitter, so that's pretty cool stuff. Very high tech compared to what I'm used to.
One, Micaiah, you don't happen to have one of the VITs, do you? That they used.
No, unfortunately, I don't have one of those.
So they one aspect of their study, they were trying to find those neonates to put the collars on. So they had the vaginal implant transmitters that they'd also have to find. And I will let them describe the struggles with trying to find those.
Yeah, I mean, Jared, if you want to, I'm happy to talk about the VIT technology a little bit. So, Alex, basically what happens is when we collar or capture a female deer, we would, give her a collar, and that collar would be basically synced with a vaginal implant transmitter, which would basically we would insert and it would continually sync the entire time it was deployed. So the VIT is what we called it, and the collar are constantly communicating with one another. And by the time it gets around to parturition, so when these females are giving birth, we really start to monitor those a little bit more clearly. But basically, these bits have a temperature and a light sensor that when she gives birth, so it would come out when she gives birth, it'll notify us if it sees light or if there's a temperature change. And so we could then go and find where these neonates are, where, the birth bed essentially, and where she gave birth, and ideally find the neonates that she gave birth to. And so there was kind of this multi-generational data that we were collecting. I do not have one of those to show you, but they kind of look like a little T and it's got a little antenna at the end. So really amazing technology that really allows us to evaluate survival of these neonates at such an early age, because by the time we kind of see them up and walking, they're several weeks to several months old at that point, and neonate and newborn fawn mortality is very high when they're a couple days old to a week old. And so we really wanted to be able to account for that. And so having this technology was really paramount for that.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine catching a 2 or 3 week old fawn, especially, once it gets its legs under it, that's a little bit daunting. Um, Anything else that surprised anybody or, you found was a challenge, um, besides convincing someone to set up a net array on their property? I can imagine that was a big ask. But I'm sure the folks were just as interested as I am in stuff like this.
And what was your perspective from the human dimension side in terms of the challenges of getting responses and anything that really surprised you about data collection aspects?
I mean, the only thing is sort of the time frame of when we were doing this. So the project was really kicking off in 2021. So there were some impacts from COVID. Some things were more on the boring side of like supply chain issues to get things put together, but also just people were kind of surveyed out a lot of the COVID effects where people wanted to see what was going on, related to everything as we went through COVID and now following that. So that definitely impacted some of our response rates across the different surveys. Um, so some of them were a little bit lower than we were expecting, and so it was interesting to see the amount of effort put in for maybe like a mailed survey versus something like the online survey, where it's really just you put in people's emails and press a button versus everything that goes into the mailed survey. So I think that was an interesting change to think about just in the context of the timing of the study itself. But other than that, it was pretty smooth for us for data collection. So not too many surprises along that pathway.
Alex, I'll note too that all of this work also involved a whole small army of seasonal technicians and undergraduate students and volunteers that came out and worked for, in the case of some of the technicians, year round on the project. And then, for example, with like Liz and Ashley's abundance work with the genetic capture recapture, a whole series of undergrad volunteers that would come out multiple days a week to help us go around and find deer poop and pick it up and bring it back to the lab. So again, you're seeing the faces here, but it was part of a much larger team that actually conducted all of the work too.
Oh, I can definitely imagine it took a definitely a small army to do this, especially on, Durham County is a small county, but it's still pretty good area. Especially when you're, picking up deer poop. That's you know, I still can't believe that that could be used for genetic analysis and figuring out, different individuals. So that's pretty interesting to me. Um, so we have all this data compiled. Um, you know, the hard work's been done. Now we're crunching numbers. Moving forward, what are we looking? What is the commission? What is deer biologists looking at? How do you guys think that this information is going to affect management, in the years to come when it comes to our whitetail deer?
So a lot of it, and I'll let them go into some of the demographics and stuff of what they like actually found. Some of it, we get complaints about deer in, these urban areas. They're being pushed into these areas. In some of the suburban areas, they're finding more food resources. So they're very adaptable. They're using these areas, and in some of these areas, their populations that really are increasing, or some of the mortality factors are changing, in the urban versus the rural areas. So, part of it for us, we do try to, help folks manage deer through programs like a community deer management assistance program. We now have a new program called Ag DMAP for agricultural producers. If they have deer damage, they can get extra tags during the season. And we also have a CWD map program and just a normal DMAP program for folks who either have too many deer or in these areas with disease. Thankfully, CWD has not been found in Durham County yet. Thank goodness, especially with all the folks we had working on deer. That would have made things so much more complicated. But yeah, so a lot of it just learning how these deer, how things change for them and their movements and their interactions for people can help us with our outreach efforts towards communities. Um, some of which, we'd love to have more folks in our urban archery program. Actively managing deer through things like hunting, or realizing that, deer, they do need to be managed even in urban areas. Otherwise, they're succumbing to vehicle collisions and impacting the health of their populations or people's health in the case of deer vehicle collisions or tick-borne diseases and things like that. But some of the other stuff, I mean, we've got our method of looking at deer density, which turned into a very different estimate from the genetic side of things. So we're looking at some of these demographic rates and stuff and comparing them to what we have estimated and seeing, how things are lining up. Um, maybe these things differ in urban versus rural areas. And that's some of what we were looking towards this study for. One of the interesting things we've talked about a lot, even for disease stuff, is the deer in this study, the yearlings, about a year and a half old, they were moving on average around 5 miles away from home, uh, you know, during either the spring or the fall of that year, which is pretty cool to actually like have that on paper. Like this is what North Carolina deer are doing. Their dates for conception were, I think it was around November 5th or, around the first, second week of November, which lines up with our data pretty closely. for conception. So we use biological data from does who are either harvested or roadkill. And that's a small sample size. Well, they actually were able to track the does and get estimates based on when the fawns were born and stuff. So this is just pretty cool stuff. And we're not tracking deer every day like us. Deer, we look at them as population, and to actually be able to track these deer and look at how they're moving and utilizing the landscape, it's pretty awesome. And we will just use it, continue to inform our management efforts. There's still a lot that we have to dig into on this side of things. So the study just wrapped up in December, and now I'm working with Jared and Makai and Nathan and everybody else to get some of the materials out there ready for public consumption. And folks like Hannah and Nils, we're working on getting those huntable lands estimates up and running so that we can, more accurately estimate our populations. Long-winded answer.
Well, it's not a simple science when it comes to managing something like that. On the cattle side, we can manage it because it's in a defined area, and we can do reproduction management. We can, synchronize our heifers and do all this, but with a wild species, it's a whole, well, lack of a better phrase, it's a whole different animal, literally and metaphorically. So yeah, I know, my circle of friends, we're always interested in stuff like this outside of work. I actually go to the gym with a wildlife resource commissioner, or not commissioner, resource commission employee, and I'm always like, hey, what's the new thing going on? What's something I need to look at? So, you know, the survey or the study just wrapped up in December. I know there's a lot of things you guys are still going through, but what's the most interesting thing you learned, you saw, you did, just anything from the study that you look back on and think that was something that just stuck out.
Hey, Alex, since I showed up late, I'll jump in now.
Okay.
So, so as a sort of sociologist, the people stuff often jump out to me just because that's what I'm really interested in. But one of the things that surprised me a little bit was that even in very urban areas of Durham, you had a large majority of people who are pretty supportive of managing deer through hunting. Um, and yeah, so that was one thing that was a little bit surprising to me, but is also good news in from the perspective of having tools available to manage white-tailed deer across the whole state.
That actually surprises me as well. So I'm glad to hear that too, because it is a good strategy. I've heard the whole in the more urban in other urban areas where they're trying to use, chemical and castration. It's like, it's not very cost effective. So having support for the outdoorsmen, it's good to hear.
I can answer a little bit as well from my specific research questions. Um, we discovered a ton of really interesting things and a ton of cool things over every project or every paper and study and student. But one of the really cool things that we found out was that the population growth which this isn't the surprising part, is that population growth rates peaked in the more suburban areas. Just looking at, typical human wildlife interactions in these suburban areas, they tend to be a lot more. However, it wasn't, due to one specific vital rate that peaked in this suburban area. It was more of like a compounding factor of all the things that contributed to population growth rate. For example, this is the surprising part for me, was you hear a lot about human shielding with wildlife species. Like certain wildlife species will take advantage of human buildings, structures, infrastructure, all that stuff to avoid predators. And so our assumptions kind of going into it was that neonate survival would be higher in these urban and suburban areas, because they would be using these human resources. However, we found that coyotes are just as urban tolerant as deer are for the most part, and predation in the first 16 weeks of life was really high. Significant, not significantly, it was higher than in the more rural areas of the risk of predation of a neonate. And then when that neonate ages and becomes older and it's more prone to being hit by vehicles because they're just naive to navigating these different urban landscapes. And so it really dropped that first year survival of deer down in the more urban areas, which was super, super interesting to me, which is not something I was expected. And then on top of that, I know you're a hunter, and hunters are always interested in the rut. We found that while our county-wide estimate of peak conception dates when we backtracked from when the fawns were born was around that November 5th date, it actually varied across the gradient by almost 2 weeks. So in the more urban areas, it was on average 14 days later than in the most rural areas. And we have a couple of theories behind that. We don't know exactly, but we did find that the buck to doe ratio in the more urban areas was a lot lower than in the rural areas. So there wasn't as many bucks, and movement was restricted in the urban areas, so they couldn't potentially breed as many does in that first cycle of estrus. So more does were getting bred in that second cycle of estrus, which pushed that conception date back in the more urban areas, which was super, super cool to me because I like to hunt and I like rut and conception dates and all that stuff to inform my decisions as a recreational hunter. So,
Makes a lot of sense. And looking back, you think about it, you see a lot more does in your suburbs and things like that. I've only ever seen in Durham County, I've only ever seen one buck in a more suburban area. And it kind of felt out of place because you're used to the does and the fawns and the yearlings. But that makes a lot of sense. It would just take longer for them to, get around.
right, exactly.
Just a side note, from more of the movement side of things, a lot of the stuff that I really focused on was movement related, and kind of, what types of resources deer select for. But we did an interesting analysis where we evaluated how deer activity patterns might change throughout a daily cycle across the gradient. And we were able to figure out that like more urban individuals, for females in particular, as they got more urban, they actually switched so their activity, like urban females would be more active at nighttime and less active during the day when we compared them to the rural females. But then males had like a totally different strategy where urban males, so males in those more urbanized settings, they just had overall decreased activity overall. And so it was kind of interesting to see that, humans are impacting, the times of day and how active deer may or may not be. So it was really interesting to kind of get that on paper and kind of really look at the data for that. And then from a survival perspective, because again, those collars helped us evaluate survival. And Jared kind of touched on a little bit of that. We found that annual survival of deer didn't change significantly across the gradient, which was kind of interesting because we thought, oh, maybe, deer in these urban spaces, they might find refuge here and, they're not going to be exposed to hunters or whatever. But as they get more urban, your risk for hunter harvest is going to decline, but your risk for vehicle collision increases enough to where those annual survival estimates were not different, which was also pretty substantial finding. So, anyways, those were just kind of some of the things that stood out to me.
I was just going to speak to this huntable land that's model that's got mentioned a few times, just to give a little information about that and how that changed, because that was something that was really interesting to me. So I think April mentioned that there is a huntable land model that's currently been in use since about 2017 or so. And basically, the idea of that is using geographic variables like parcel size, housing density, road density to predict each parcel, like the probability that it could be hunted. And with this project, we wanted to see, does that model that's currently in use still hold up? Because the original model automatically disincluded parcels that were in the municipal boundaries. So with this being an urban to rural look at deer, does this huntable lands model still hold up if we include those more urban areas? And I was really surprised that the answer is yes. The accuracy was still about 90% for the individual parcels, even with those smaller urban ones. And we even did an updated version to say, hey, can we get a model that works a little bit better when we're starting from the beginning with these urban parcels as well? And it was basically the exact same accuracy. So the model that the commission has been using does still hold up. But the land is changing still. Like with urbanization, that was a pretty stark difference we saw that when we applied the model using the housing density and road density and parcel size from later on, I think we were using 2023 data. We just saw a drop in what was considered huntable across the landscape. So we were seeing visual differences across time, but the way to measure or predict if a parcel was hunted or not does hold up from the model they're currently using.
There were a lot of things about this study that, were just awesome to me. But one thing that hadn't already been mentioned was some of the methods were looking at impervious surfaces and trying to get a value on, uh, for these deer, whether or not they were more rural or a more urban individual. So some of those urbanness values, they were pretty interesting to me. And another thing, oh, I'll send a request for sharing. People, they like the deer, they like to see them. They might not like them eating their vegetation, or getting hit by their car. Obvious things there. But seeing that another impact of people on deer was this individual here that was an urban deer study
Mm.
deer who had laminitis and was, or foundering because he was probably fed too much corn, too high of a carbohydrate load in his diet compared to other things. And so his hooves started to malform, and now you can see he's skinny. He's having issues getting around and getting the food he needs. And this is a human created issue for this individual. Out normally doing his thing, he would be getting, the appropriate diet that would not lead to laminitis. And you probably see this more with the livestock animals. And yeah, this individual, he ended up with laminitis because people meaning well, they're like, oh, I want to feed the deer. Well, feeding them corn is just like feeding them candy. It's not very good nutrition. And it just allows you to see them. It doesn't really provide much value for them.
Yeah, in cases like this, it'd probably be more beneficial to the deer just to let them do their thing, and they've been around longer than we have on this continent. They'll be just fine. And um but I really appreciate the time y'all took. This was I think our people that listen to this will get a kick out of what they've heard, and they enjoy learning about it, but also selfishly I really enjoyed learning about it, because like Jared said, I enjoy seeing deer. Most of the time I don't enjoy it when they see me when I'm trying to see them. But most of the time they usually see me before I see them. But that's something else entirely. But I appreciate you guys taking the time out to speak with us, and you know, hopefully, we continue doing stuff like this for the listeners, and they can, hear about all the good work going on the ag side and beyond.